Hi, Misha here, and I guess we're kind of wrapping up a look at the blade that began with the M3 here. Here's one was not in the first video. Camelus one, and an original M8 scabbard. And we talked about quite a few others and how it came to be, including the second version, or the one meant for the M1 carbine, the M4. As we move past the M5, and here's another M6 you didn't see, another parade version for the M14. This was chrome notwithstanding, the standard issue Bayonet in the 1960s. In some ways developed right alongside the M14, or even before it, along the M5. And today's topic is a little interesting. The M7. Because in some ways, this was made by Colt. Not the U.S. government, not Springfield, whatever, for the, of course, AR15 as it was originally known in 1960 when Colt was introducing it. So we're going to talk about it a bit, including this variant here and several others. And as always, if you could, like, share, and subscribe. Bayonet videos are a niche item, but they're fun. So hope you enjoy them too. If you'd like to help support us, you know, you can always check out Patreon. With that, well, now this one's cool that it's a Colt, but it's a later style 70s Colt. Sometimes known as the new model M7. It actually kind of all goes back to the M4 here. When they kind of went to the modern bayonet lug for the AR15, they took this, they enlarged the ring, and they did this latch, but they made it much larger and frankly beefier. You can see here, so they're absolutely not interchangeable, but the style, the system, it's the same. Take close inspiration from the M6 in the way they constructed it, but this is a totally different latching system and a different ring style because it's not quite the same. By the way, the scabbard, the TWB, we'll get there. Kind of interesting, for me especially. So in 1961, Colt introduced the original M7 bayonet for the AR-15, and of course Colt's not a knife maker. These were made for Colt by Universal in Connecticut. They had green grips, some sources say brown, to kind of go with the greener brown Colt 601s of the era. Don't know how many exactly were made, but you know, around 20,000 at most. But the original ones were a little bit different. In 1963, the new pattern came out here with the style of what they considered universal grip. Larger hilt, larger crossguard. The original pattern had more of a narrow crossguard. And they went to what they called the rounded runout. And the first of the new patterns, as far as I know, were made under contract for Colt by Imperial. You know, 63, 64, 65. Still commercial. And they would do about 30,000 of those. And they had this interesting scabbard, even though it's marked M8A1, it's not the traditional kind of cloth fiberglass stuff. This is injection molded nylon. That's why it has a different texture to it. No metal tip either. But this is correct for the Colt scabbard. This one here was made in the mid-70s in West Germany by the Carl Eichhorn company, under contract for Colt. And they actually made the largest number, even though Eichhorn would go out of business and evolve into another company we'll call AES, just to kind of split it apart. In 1976, thereabouts, they would make about 80,000. So, yeah, Colt had roughly 125, 130,000 M7 bayonets made for themselves. It weighs about 10 ounces. It's a little bit longer because of the adapter lug back here. Same kind of blade, about 6 3/4 long, 22 millimeter ring. And these would often ship either with commercial, like SP1s in the type, or sometimes foreign military sales. And the earliest U.S. service ones that were sold to the Air Force early on might have also had these. But when the XM16E1 was provisionally adopted and they were going to buy 100,000, in 1964, the first contract to produce these for the DoD was let out, and it would go to our old favorite company, Milpar. This is not a Milpar. I should also mention that the M8A1 scabbard is still being ordered at this time. The Victory Plastics, the VP, they get their last contract around 1960, and by 64, 65, a new company, the PWH, Pennsylvania Working Home for the Blind, as it was, would get the contract, and they would produce the majority of these scabbards up through around 1969. And there'd be a few minor differences from the earlier ones, mostly in the way they did the hole here for the leg tie. It's one reason I mentioned this, because late in, they did change their name to the Working Home for the Blind, TWB. And that would be pretty much the final contract let out in 1970, and I think the last ones were delivered around 71, 72 for the M8A1 scabbard. The problem is, while there's technology to make the scabbard, the plastic, as it was known, it's not though, it's, like I said, fiberglass, was really good for the 1940s. By the 60s, it was, frankly, not cutting edge tech. It was more problematic to make, and it was actually harder and harder to find manufacturers that could do it in the quantities needed for the price let out. And Colt going to the injection molded nylon scabbard here really showed the way of the future. So we'll get to the end of the M8A1 later on. Anyway, Milpar was the first to be contracted to make these, around 95,000 in May of 1964, and they'd start to deliver them by February of 1965, and they have the same problems of manufacturing as they did with their other bayonet contracts. Nevertheless, they would get more. They would actually get a direct contract for the U.S. Marine Corps in 1966, and they would still deliver these by 1969, but by that point, the government is done with them. And that's where we get this maker here, BOC, Boer Ordnance Company. In 1968, BOC would get their first contract. Fun fact, looks like Milpar was again the low bidder, but because of all their difficulties, they were passed over for BOC. And they would actually become one of the biggest makers of M7 in history, turning out over 1,800,000 in a pretty quick time period, 68 through 70, that period, it's pretty rapid. And these would be the Vietnam era, issued with the M16A1. There would also, before them, be Conetta, who had made other bayonets we talked about in previous videos. They would get a contract to make the M7 in 66. And they would actually get a second contract in 67, but kind of like with Milpar, they were having their own financial troubles, company troubles, and eventually they would just go bankrupt and out of business before 1970. And no one even knows how many Conettas were actually delivered. At least 300,000. Some sources say it had to be more because of the money. I don't know. Doesn't really matter, I suppose. But after Milpar and Conetta kind of failed, they went to the new maker, BOC, and they were able to actually crank these out in the quantities needed for Vietnam, and they would usually be equipped with the scabbard made by the blind folks in Pennsylvania. Although quite a few would also go to foreign military aid later on. But it would not at all end there, even though they had a quantity of 2 million. This is an Imperial, although it's in a later style scabbard. Kind of neat because it has the curved spine, although it still has the straight run out on this one. The first Imperial contracts would be around 1973, 74. And they would have a couple more with their final M7 contract coming in 83, 84. By this point, they actually changed their name to Imperial Schrade. And that would actually be their last government contract because they lost out on the whole M9 bayonet thing, but that's not in this video. There would also be a small maker, Fraser, around 1970, 71. They'd make about 40,000, and that seemed to have mostly been for foreign military sales because by 1970, 72, the M16A1 is starting to get exported to allies, for example, South Korea. How many Imperials were made? I don't rightly know, but about 350, 360,000 seems to kind of be a number. This bayonet is kind of special to me. It's my first M7 I picked up about 30 years ago. It is what it is. Again, the scabbard. It's either a straight up repop or just a foreign contract. But it definitely has the injection molded kind of nylon shape as opposed to the fiberglass. But it's cool. And kind of like the Imperial brand. They really were the beginning of this whole thing, going all the way back to the designing of the M3, this dagger point blade. So that was kind of the Vietnam era M7s. However, with over 4 million made, it's far from the end of this story. Now we kind of move into the second era of the M7, talking about Ontario. But first, the N10 scabbard. This was created with modern injection molding technology and actually dates back all the way to 1970. But it wasn't ordered until the 1980s because they just had so many M8s and Vietnam ended. But it was there. We have an actual nylon hanger stitched on. Simple scabbard. Easy to scale up, scale down. Nothing special needed, just plastics and nylon. Light. The only bad side is it's disposable. There's nothing that can be replaced, refurbished on here. If something breaks, you just toss it. And after Imperial, we will see a bit of a gap in M7 contracts until, ironically, the M9 is adopted. Like I said, that kind of pushed Imperial out when they lost that. But in 1985 and 1987, a couple of new makers come online. 85 General Cutlery will get their first M7 contract, and they would get a couple more throughout the 80s. And then towards the end of 1987, Ontario here will get their first contract. Be among the first to ship them as a package. Typically before they would buy scabbards and bayonets separately, put them together. Now, going forward, you can either buy bayonets, you can buy scabbards, or you can buy them as a set together. And the numbers would be much smaller at this point. A lot of these contracts would be 50, 60,000. Moving into the 90s, Gen Cut, as their blades were marked, would actually look into making the M9, but they weren't set up for it, but they were good at the M7. In fact, they would become a subcontractor for Land K, who was making the M9, when they got a contract in 1998 to make all of 1,200 M7s. This was kind of contingent to keep their M9 contract and whatnot, and the government needed them. So they basically just sourced out to Gen Cut, who'd been previously making some M7s for foreign military customers anyway. So they will make a few under the Land-K brand name. And this would actually pick up in 2005. Again, War on Terror. An urgent requirement for 12,000 more M7s is placed by the U.S. government. It's supposed to be delivered by 2006. Again, Land-K is the prime contractor, with Gen Cut being the subcontractor. And this goes horribly, frankly. In fact, Gen Cut is way behind schedule on delivery, not getting their final M7s delivered until like the end of 2008. They had to get extensions, and no one's happy. This is pretty much the end of it for Gen Cut, and I don't think even Land-K is doing so hot after this. Basically leads to Ontario being the sole source provider with pretty much indefinite delivery, indefinite quantity contracts, starting at least by 2009, although some sources say 2006. Either way, Ontario becomes the big knife provider. In fact, I think they had 6 major contracts, and they were a subcontractor on 3 more, working with other companies. They would provide M7s and M9s. They would provide just scabbards or scabbard and bayonet combos. You know, whatever the government wanted, and pretty much there'd be all kinds of orders placed, with the final one, I think, placed in 2020 and fulfilled in 2023. Unfortunately, there's kind of a sad note there. A long-standing maker since right after World War II, yeah, they get bought out and the factory gets shut down. Again, like I said, in 85, the M7 was replaced in the Army by the M9, and it would hang on in the Marine Corps until 2003, when it was replaced by the OKC-3S, which also was made by Ontario. And so they were the sole provider of it too. So with them going under a couple of years ago, it does kind of lead to a bit of a pickle, not gonna lie. Let's just very briefly talk about a couple of foreign military sales contracts and a variant or two. Revisiting our Colt here, like I said, this was made by Carl Eichhorn in the 70s, and the successor company, AES, A. Eichhorn, it kept on making bayonets. Not just for commercial, but they had military contracts. I know they provided some to Israel. So even though the Colt part would end, they would keep making them. They would even have a version with a short tang that was basically done where they could use a lot of the same components to make G3 bayonets, just, you know, different butt end there, because the blade is pretty much the same. And there's all kinds of interesting variants, contracts they did after Colt. And frankly, they are good quality. Maybe not the tippy-top best, but yeah, I can't complain. In 1991, Gen Cut would get a contract to make 30,000 M7s along with M10 scabbards for Australia. They had just adopted the F-88 AUG. Going way back in time, 1968, Korea first started receiving M16A1s and then started making their own K-M16A1s. And same would go for the Bayonet. They would have their own variant, an exact copy along with the M8A1 scabbard. But here is a not exact copy. From Taiwan, the T65 bayonet, also used on the T91. At first, it might look like a copy of an M7, but the devil's in the details, and once you really grasp it, they took the pattern, they gave it a longer blade and a more narrow one. So at about, instead of going from about 6 3/4 inches, this is over 8 inches long. So not quite 1.5 inches longer and more narrow. To go with it, of course, they needed a new shape of scabbard, so it's longer. And it has, which is kind of funny to me, a false tip here, whereas the metal would be on a regular one. They just put an extra reinforced plastic here, which, again, for an injection molded, this isn't fiberglass. It's fine. Another kind of cool foreign copy that I wish I had, but I don't, is the Canadian C7 bayonet. adopted in 83, I believe, 84, for the C7, C8, that series. Made by Nella up there. They produced 70, 80,000. Pretty much identical to a 80s M7, except they have a stainless steel blade instead of carbon steel. That's neat to me. And that would serve in Canada for about 20 years as well. We could go on and on. Lots of foreign military contracts and users, unofficial and official copies. Of course, plenty made in China now. It's a simple, durable bayonet, and that's again why over 4 million have been produced, both commercially and for military. And even though it's officially phased out in America, trust me, there's still plenty inactive. We kind of began this series looking at the M3 fighting knife, which very quickly evolved into the M4, which was not just a bayonet. It originally in World War II was also meant to be just a fighting knife, and then of course Colt made our M7 here, and this is pretty much a modern copy, modern version. Scabbard. I should mention that Ontario did market the M7B version for a while in the 21st century. Basically the same, except slightly different ring, meant to work better with an M4 versus an M16. And the grip was kind of rubbery material instead of the hard plastic, hard polymer. So there is the M7B. I do not know if that was commercial or export, or if the U.S. military actually got some, because, again, they were mostly buying M9s and the OKC-3S at this point. If anyone knows if the M7B went into official service, yeah, let me know, please. But it's a cool variant. Don't have one, but maybe one day I will. And this wraps up the family. Began in 1943. The last ones were delivered in 2023. So right at 80 years for this style of blade. And millions upon millions in the world. Millions upon millions of scabbards, including some of these over here made by blind folks like me. So that's a thing that happened. Kind of neat in my opinion. So that's it here. But if you'd like to hear more about variations in foreign service, maybe the M9, the OKC-3, let me know. We can definitely dive into other bayonets that kind of fit the AR platform in similar guns like the G36 and what have you. Let me know. Anyway, for those who tuned in for these videos, I greatly appreciate it. Please do comment, share your own bayonets, and if you could, help us out on Patreon. But if not, it's fine too. With that, this is Misha. Catch you very soon next time.